Let's start with the preface for Mere Christianity. And you have to understand, one of the reasons Lewis was asked to do these by the BBC. First of all, can you imagine today's BBC ever doing anything like that? No, because the building would be torched and bombed. I mean, it would be crazy. Is because of Screwtape. It was because of the publication of Screwtape that Lewis became internationally famous. I mean, there is a image, I could pull it up on the computer. There's an image of Lewis in a 1939 issue of Time magazine. It's a woodcut of Lewis with a little demon on his shoulder, Screwtape. Okay, I mean, he became famous for that one book, even though he'd actually published a few books before then, but none of them were, in terms of mass fiction, very good, like Pilgrim's Regress. Nobody read. Very few people still read it, unless you're Lewis freaks. Allegory of Love, a lot of academics read, but no normal people read. Okay, so he was asked to do these talks because it was thought he had a special knack for explaining complex theology in everyday, ordinary, simple language. Okay, even though obviously Mere Christianity had not been published yet, because it was the talks that later on become published as Mere Christianity. It was on the basis solely of what he had to say in Screwtape. So he starts off telling us, in that first paragraph, the contents of this book were first published 3 separate parts. Broadcast Talks, 1942, Christian Behavior, 1943, and Beyond Personality, 1944. You can still find and use bookstores, not as much in the United States as you can in England, those individual volumes, Broadcast Talks, Christian Behavior, and Beyond Personality. They are harder to find. First editions of them, however, are rather rare and quite expensive. Okay. Notice the time period that he's delivering these. I mean, it's in the middle of the Second World War. It's after the Battle of Britain, because the Battle of Britain is early 1941, but it's still when things are not going well in England. The U.S. is now in the war, so the tide is kind of turning a little bit. Okay, go on to the next paragraph, and right about in the middle of the next paragraph, Lewis talks about what kind of Christian, let's say, he is. And he's telling his audience, you're not going to hear me talking about denominational differences. Okay? You'll not learn from me whether you ought to become an Anglican, a Methodist, Presbyterian, Catholic. No. He says none of that. He says, I'm an ordinary layman of the Church of England, not especially high, nor especially low. That is, high church Anglican, full vestments, strict adherence to the original Book of Common Prayer, etc., nor low church Anglican church, meaning not as many vestments. We're not going to follow the Book of Common Prayer quite as strictly. Doesn't mean that it's watered down theologically or anything. Okay? He says, no. Ever since I became a Christian, I've thought that the best, perhaps the only service I could do for my unbelieving neighbors was to explain and defend the belief that has been common to nearly all Christians at all times. Okay? And when he says that, when he talks about that belief, common to nearly all Christians at all times, what Lewis is doing is he's talking largely about what the early church essentially said what was necessary to be considered a Christian. In other words, one of the hallmarks that the early church suggested, that the early church taught was heresy. Whatever the heresy, it doesn't matter what the specific heresy is, was that it is an idea that is not universally accepted. Okay? Not universally meaning if all the people in this room comprised the church, it didn't mean all 100%, but it meant the large majority, not 51%. Okay? A large majority. Think political, a supermajority, as it were. Okay? So it's what the church universally held, and what that means is generally all places, all times, all people, meaning all Christians. Okay? And we might talk about that a little bit more. So he says, what I'm talking about here is the belief that's been common to nearly all Christians at all times. That's what he's later on going to call mere Christianity. Okay? Skip down several more lines, and he's talking about divisions. Our division should never be discussed except in the presence of those who have already come to believe that there is one God and that Jesus Christ is his only Son. Well, why is that the case? Why should divisions among Christians only be discussed among Christians? Or, let's take, I know this is mere Christianity, but let's take that out of it for a moment. Why should, if you follow Lewis's logic, divisions among Democrats only be discussed among Democrats? Or divisions among Republicans only among Republicans? What's his point?
Because then it causes division between the average populace as well.
Okay.
You don't want the other side to know your weakness.
You don't want the other side to know your weakness, or flip that around. You don't want the other side to be dragged down by your weakness, by your division.
Makes you seem weak.
So also, it's kind of tasteless. It's like it's airing your
dirty laundry. Okay.
Public.
Now skip most of the rest of the preface and go to 1, 2, 3, the fourth to the last paragraph.
You said fourth?
Yeah, fourth to the last. Paragraph that begins, now if once we allow. Okay. Now if once we allow people to start, almost said stipulating, to start spiritualizing and refining, or as they might say, deepening the sense of the word Christian, it too will speedily become a useless word. Deepening, that is, not pulling the meaning out of the word, but trying to make it deeper than what it really is. In the first place, Christians themselves will never be able to apply it to anyone. It is not for us to say who, in the deepest sense, is or is not close to the Spirit of Christ. Wait, but he's writing a book called Mere Christianity, which is talking about what comprises Christianity. And yet, he's saying, Christians of all people should not say who is or is not close to the Spirit of Christ. If you look around you today in most churches, this is where I have to be kind of careful. Most churches kind of explicitly say that's their task. Okay? They're used. Go ahead.
They use it as a scare tactic.
Yeah. I mean, there's a church nearby, used to be across the street from MTSU. I always say this to almost all my classes. I don't know if they still have these buses or not, but it had a bus, had the flames of hell on it, and the words written on the side, pulling souls out of hell one at a time. What is the implication of that nice little motto or slogan? What is the natural state of souls? Hell. Okay? Kind of reminiscent of Jonathan Edwards, in my opinion, his very twisted theology of sinners in the hands of an angry God. Because what, according to Edwards, if you're familiar with that sermon, what is God doing with those sinners that are in his hands.
Dangling.
Dangling them over hell. Like, hanging from a single thread. Kind of, I feel the heat there. Yeah. What's it?
And it doesn't matter if you're good or bad.
Yeah, we can talk about the Calvinistic aspect later, maybe. Right? In fact, we will at some point. So he says, we do not see into men's hearts. We cannot judge and are indeed forbidden to judge. Now, I would say an awful lot of Christians need to remember that or relearn that, because that's what's going on all too often. I mean, just look at the presidential campaign. You've got of whatever stripe, many, who want to condemn Mitt Romney because he's a Mormon. And you have Christians of other stripes, and sometimes maybe the same stripes, who want to say President Obama is a Muslim. And therefore, deserving of his own little circle in hell. And the Mormons are deserving of their own little circle in hell. And everybody who doesn't think like me is deserving of their own little circle in hell.
Everybody follows that line of thinking, though, they're going to be in heaven.
Well, okay.
Everyone.
Now the Calvinism. Everybody know what TULIP stands for? Okay. Unless you've been a Presbyterian, you probably wouldn't. And I used to be a card-carrying kind of, Presbyterian. This is the thought of John Calvin, gleaned from his Institutes of the Christian Religion, okay, written in 1520. The T stands for total depravity. Okay? And what means by that is there is nothing in everything people do that is not tinged, tainted by sin. Nothing. That is, you're rescuing a baby from a fire, rushing up, the firemen who ran to the Twin Towers. Something of what they did was tainted by sin. In other words, there is no completely 100% altruistic act by anybody. Even she helped the untouchables in Calcutta because she wanted people to think good about her or something like that. Right? Unconditional election. That means those whom God chooses to be saved are chosen because God chooses them to be saved. Okay? No way around it. If God chooses Paul to be saved, there's nothing Paul does that can stop that from happening. Period. Okay? It's unconditional. What the unconditional means is it's not conditional on our actions. We cannot earn, in other words, election. Nothing you can do that earns it. L, limited atonement. Died only for these, the elect. So when various parts of the New Testament say Christ died for all men, not really. It really mean that. It means all men of those who are elect. They just forgot to add that kind of part. Okay? And keep in mind, when I say this and I kind of snarky and sarcastic, I mean, I went to a conservative Presbyterian liberal arts college. My nickname was TR. I mean, I believe this stuff hook, line, and sinker. Okay? I hate this word because I can never spell it right. Irresistible grace. It's kind of related to this. Those whom God showers grace upon, you cannot resist. You can't say no to it. And P, because of this, perseverance of the saints. Okay? Now, what the way this usually works is the unconditional, because you are the elect, you will show the quote unquote fruits of the Spirit and such. And that grace will be manifest in you. Persevere to the end. That is, you will never turn your back on God. You won't be a Mother Teresa all your life and then on your deathbed, the hell with you. You know, Job's wife's cursed God and died kind of a thing. Okay? Perseverance of the saints. You stick it out. So, commonly just called tulip. An oversimplification? Yes, completely. Okay? So, Lewis says we cannot judge and are forbidden to judge. Go on to the next paragraph. We must therefore stick to the original obvious meaning. That is, the original obvious meaning of Christians. The name Christian was first given at Antioch to the disciples, to those who accepted the teaching of the apostles. Okay? That's where the word comes into use. So Lewis says, here's what I'm saying. I'm using the word in the way it was originally meant. Those who accepted the teaching of the apostles. Okay? Which apostles? The original apostles of the early church. The 12. And their teachings. Okay? Skip another couple of sentences. The point is not a theological or moral one. It is only a question of words so that we can all understand what is being said. And for Lewis, this is a major point. Okay? You'll see when we get to, assuming we do, Surprised by Joy. Lewis will talk about part of his early education when he went and studied with a tutor, lived with the gentleman for a couple of years and his wife. And Lewis, when he first met him, spouted off something, just tried to make small talk. And the guy who Lewis nicknames the Great Knock just jumped down his throat every which way. Well, why did you say that? What do you mean by that? Really? Kind of like the way Gandalf does Bilbo when Bilbo says, good day. Really? Now what do you mean by, now you mean kiss off, buddy. Okay. The Knock taught Lewis, don't let anybody say anything flippantly. Always challenge the meanings of words that people use. So here he's telling us, let's be precise how we talk. Okay? I hope no reader will suppose that mere Christianity is here put forward as an alternative to the creeds of the existing communions. That is, this is not meant to replace, if you're Presbyterian, the Westminster Confession of Faith. If you're Anglican, it's not meant to replace the 39 Articles. Okay? It's more like a hall. That is, mere Christianity. It's more like a hall out of which doors open into several rooms. If I can bring anyone into that hall, I shall have done what I attempted. But it's in the rooms, not in the hall, that there are fires and chairs and meals. In other words, his term mere Christianity is like an anteroom. Ante, meaning before, in front of, that you come into before you go where you're really trying to go. And where you're really trying to go, as he says, may be the Greek Orthodox Church, it may be Catholicism, it may be Baptist, it may be Methodist, it may be whatever. Okay? But the hall is just a waiting place. So this is the basics. Or think of it, if you think of it as a tree, the hall, or mere Christianity, is everything below ground. It's the roots. The tree, out of which the roots grow, then develops the branches of the differing denominations and such. I know it's not a very good tree. I'm getting looks like, that's a tree? I had my daughter come in and draw it for you. So, skipping down to the end of that paragraph. Talking about waiting in the hall and such. But you must regard it as waiting, not as camping. You must keep on praying for light. And above all, you must be asking which door is the true one. Okay? Not which one pleases you best by its paint and paneling. Ooh, think about that for a moment. Which door is the true one? So if you go into a room, let's say it's a circular room. I'm thinking Harry Potter for some reason. And you've got a door here, 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 and here. You don't choose the doors because of their appearance. Well, what does that mean in terms of the various churches, the various denominations and dispensations and such? The outward trappings. You don't go to this church because, it's got the service that meets your time scheduling best. Or it's got the funny preacher, or it's got the best sound system, or it's got, notice what Lewis says. You choose it by whether or not it is true. In plain language, the question should never be, do I like that kind of service? But are these doctrines true? Is holiness here? Okay? Does my conscience move me toward this? Is my reluctance to knock at this door due to my pride or my mere taste or my personal dislike of this particular doorkeeper? I mean, you can already see all of the echoes of Screwtape. I mean, it's just bubbling up. So when you've reached your own room, you've gone in through one of the doors, be kind to those who have chosen different doors. And to those who are still in the hall. If they are wrong, those who are still in the hall, or those who have chosen different doors. If they're wrong, they need your prayers all the more. What do they therefore not need?
Judgment.
Your judgment. And if they are your enemies, then you are under orders to pray for them. Wow. That is one of the rules common to the whole house. Okay? I once had a priest say, when my wife and I were looking into the Orthodox Church, once had a priest say, and this was one of the clinchers for us, say to us, that in his talking about the Orthodox Church, and I'm not saying this to try to convert, it's exactly what Lewis is talking about, is he said, this priest said, we don't say where other people can't find the fullness of God. This is where we say we have found it. That's what Lewis is talking about. If you have found holiness here, then you can't say that somebody else doesn't find it here. All you can say is, this is where I have found it. Okay? And if somebody else claims it here, that doesn't mean you can say, well, no, it's not, because I have it here. So, he begins with the law of human nature. This is an idea that is no longer held valid. Screwtape wrote about that. Okay, he said there used to be this idea of human nature, but people don't believe it as much anymore, which is beneficial for the tempters. So Lewis begins with an image. He sets up a story. And everyone in this room has experienced this before. Everyone has heard people quarreling. Sometimes it sounds funny, sometimes it sounds merely unpleasant. But however it sounds, we can learn something from it. They say things like this: how'd you like it if someone did the same thing to you? That's my seat, I was there. Oh, he isn't doing you any harm. Why should you shove in first? Give me a bit of your orange, I gave you a bit of mine. You're waiting in line for a movie before Fandango. You're waiting in line for a movie and you get up 5 people away from the thing and it sells out. Okay? Or you're waiting in line for a movie and somebody 2 people ahead of you lets 5 more people come in. What do you say? After a few expletives, possibly.
No, that's awesome.
That's not fair. Okay? Now, what interests me about all these remarks is that the man who makes them is not merely saying that the other man's behavior does not happen to please him. He's appealing to some kind of standard of behavior, which he expects the other man to know about. Like you're waiting for a parking spot, you've got on, somebody's backing up. The way they back out, it blocks you, and somebody coming from the other direction. We actually had a staff issue a couple of years ago over a situation like that.
Surprised
Okay.
we're doing it this semester.
It's, we're still early.
Yeah.
Give them time.
And a lot of
Okay.
medals now.
So what does he say? He says the man is kind of appealing, and someone else said, "The hell with your standard." Else does something to the man who says, "To hell with your standard." What does he do?
How could you do that?
How could you do that? That's not fair. Lewis's point, he says, both parties have in mind some kind of law or rule of fair play. Notice, their particulars of what is fair might be totally different. That is, what is considered fair in the United States might be totally different from what is considered fair in Afghanistan. But both cultures have this standard of fairness. That's the point that he's getting at. Okay? Now, this law or rule about right or wrong, next paragraph, used to be nature. Says now we don't really use such phrases anymore. But the important thing about that, unlike a law of nature like gravity, what can we do with
Choose to disobey.
we can choose to disobey. Unfortunately, we can't choose to disobey the law of gravity. Even if we happen to be stoned out of our gourds on PSP or, bath salts or whatever the drug du jour is, okay? We can't open the window, 3-story building, and fly. And just say, I choose to disobey the law of gravity. And it suddenly happens. No. But we can choose to disobey the law of nature. That law of fairness. When usually do we make that kind of choice?
You're late to class and someone's trying to get your targets.
Yeah. The class, and so, you cut in front of somebody else. You don't let somebody else onto the road before you, okay? When you're inconvenienced, or, put it another way, when it benefits you, okay? So, skip on to the next paragraph. I think it's the next paragraph. No, it's not. Second one after that. This law was called the law of nature, he says. Why? People thought that everyone knew it by nature and did not need to be taught it. Most of you guys are too young to remember, but when Clarence Thomas had his Supreme Court nomination hearings, confirmation hearings, before the Senate, before the whole Anita Hill stuff was brought in, one of the things senators grilled him on was this idea of a law of nature. Nature and nature's law. Okay? Because Thomas is what's called an originalist when it comes to interpreting the Constitution. Well, the Constitution does refer to nature and natural law, as does the Declaration of Independence and other founding documents. Okay? So, understand what that meant within the context of late 18th century Western European intellectual thought. Whereas late 20th century senators essentially said, but that is a foreign thought to late 20th century America. We ought to completely throw it out the door. Okay? So, Lewis goes on with the next paragraph. I know that some people say the idea of a law of nature or decent behavior known to all men is unsound. Why? Because different civilizations and ages have had quite different moralities. Okay, he's going to get at what I just mentioned a minute ago. But this isn't true. Yes, they do have different particulars, but they do still appeal to some kind of standard. Okay? So it seems then, skipping couple paragraphs, then we're forced to believe in a real right and wrong. people may be sometimes mistaken about them. That is, as to what is right and what is wrong. Just as people sometimes get their sums wrong. But they are not a matter of mere taste and opinion any more than the multiplication table. In other words, you can't go to school and say, yeah, you know, for me today, 7 times 7 is going to be 56. Because that's what I want it to mean. No, it doesn't really work that way, Lewis is pointing out. All right? So he says, I'm trying not to beat this horse. I'm only trying to call attention to a fact. Here's the fact. This year, this month, or even this very day, we have failed to practice ourselves the kind of behavior we expect from other people. That's what he's really trying to get to. He's not trying to get to the fact that there is this standard. He's just saying, I'm trying to get you, my listeners, because keep in mind, this is over the radio. During the war, people are suffering. Americans haven't suffered the kind of deprivation that the people enduring here during the Second World War since the Second World War, in terms of the national will coming together. You know, Vietnam, Korea, none of the wars after the Second World War did people in the United States have to give up things in order for that war effort. Give up clothing, give up food, have, you know, milk rationed and such. Right? So he says, I'm trying to get us to think that, you know, we haven't done to other people what we expect them to do to us. There might be all kinds of excuses, however. Right? The time you were so unfair to the children, you were tired. This business about the money, that you were hard up for cash. So, the truth is, that paragraph, the truth is we believe in decency so much, that is, this fair play. We feel the law pressing on us so much that we cannot bear to face the fact that we are breaking it. And consequently, we try to shift the responsibility. That is, we come up with an excuse. I couldn't come up with the idea for a paper, so I borrowed one from somebody else. Downloaded one off the internet. Okay? These then are the 2 points I wanted to make. First, human beings on earth have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way and they can't get rid of it. This oughtness to human nature. Okay? And second, that they do not in fact behave that way. So they come up with this idea of a standard, a moral or behavioral standard. That's the first idea. Everybody has this. And two, there is an awareness that that standard has been broken, that they don't live by it. Right? These facts, now Lewis calls these facts, are the foundation of all clear thinking about ourselves and the universe we live in. In other words, to really go on from this point, you have to accept these. Because if you don't accept these, he seems to be saying we can't really have a conversation. Okay? This is why words become important and definitions of words. So, look at the very next chapter. Objections. It's almost as if he knows what his auditors are going to say. Why?
Are those not objections?
Yeah. And he's a university professor. And I'm not saying that because students come up with objections. He's used to this from his colleagues. Okay? Bear in mind, I didn't give you any background stuff. Lewis's degrees from Oxford were, he took a first in Greats. Greats is classics and philosophy. Okay? Plato, Aristotle, Aeschylus, Euripides, Sophocles, in the originals. Okay? So Greek, essentially. All right? And then he also took a first in mods, modern literature, which at that time in Oxford was like 1700 to 1850 or so. Okay? So he covered the really old stuff and he covered the really modern stuff. And one of the absolutely disgusting things that I hate about him is everything in between as well. He knew. Okay? So, some objections. Look at the second paragraph, about halfway through. Supposing you hear a cry for help from a man in danger, you'll probably feel two desires. One, a desire to give help due to your herd instinct. The other, a desire to keep out of danger due to the self-preservation instinct. Okay, pretty natural. But you'll find inside you, in addition to these two impulses, a third thing which tells you that you ought to follow the impulse to help and suppress the impulse to run away. This thing that judges between two instincts, that decides which should be encouraged, cannot itself be either of them. That is, if you have this instinct to go help when help is needed, and an instinct to run away, because running away will preserve the self, and yet there's something else inside that tells you you ought to do the first and not the second, then that third thing can't be one of those two. In other words, it can't be an instinct. It's got to be something else. It's got to come from somewhere else. Okay? Skip a whole bunch and go to the second paragraph after that, the one that begins, here is a third way of seeing it, where he says, if the moral law was one of our instincts, we ought to be able to point to some impulse inside us, which was always what we call good, always in agreement with the rule of right behavior. But you can't. Skip down several lines there, and where he says, strictly speaking, there are no such things as good and bad impulses. Now, there's an idea that seems foreign. It says, think of a piano. It doesn't have two kinds of notes on it, the right ones and the wrong ones. Right? It's got notes. What becomes a right note and a wrong note?
Played the wrong way.
Timing.
Yeah. When they're played incorrectly. When it produces disharmony rather than harmony. So he says, the moral law is not any one instinct or set of instincts. It's something which makes a kind of tune. The tune we call goodness or right conduct by directing the instincts. In other words, the moral law kind of becomes the score that our instincts play by. Or to use old kind of programming language, it's the punch card that determines what the computer does. So, skip the next paragraph. And he says, other people wrote to me saying, isn't what you call the moral law just a social convention, something that's put into us by education, or what modern thinkers would call a social construct? Isn't your notion of good merely something that our society has created? Okay. And what is thought today to be a social construct goes so far beyond just this idea of a moral law. The notion of gender as a moral construct or as a social construct. Right? Lewis, no. The people who ask that question are usually taking it for granted that if we've learned a thing from parents and teachers, then that thing must be merely a human invention. Is color a human invention? But don't you have to be taught your colors? Yes, you do. You have to be taught. This is yellow, this is red, this is blue, this is green. You have to be taught your shapes. Are shapes a human invention? No.
This isn't that whole self-creation thing that Tolkien was talking about.
Yeah. Okay. So he goes on. Some of the things we learn are mere conventions, which might have been different. For example, we call this a bottle. We don't have to. This bottle does not have bottleness about it. If we all agreed, and if we represented all of humanity, and all of humanity agreed, we could call this an automobile. Wouldn't make sense because auto itself, mobile, moving, has kind of a self-reference to it. But we could call it an automobile, or we could call it a banana, or we could call it a dog, we could call it a student, or a teacher. We could, whatever we wanted to. Okay, the names of things are conventions. We call this thing a podium. Why? Because somebody a long time ago did, and it stuck. Okay? We call those 14-line poems that have a certain structure a sonnet. We could have called them an epic, is Lewis's point. Okay? Other things, however, like mathematics, are real truths. In other words, you cannot say, were this equal one separate thing, and this equals one separate thing, and this equals one separate thing, and this equals one separate thing. In other words, these are now things, and those are two things. You can never say that. 2 plus 2 mathematically can never be 5, nor can it be 3. It will always and forever, from before the beginning of time to after the end of time, it will be 4. That is a mathematical certainty. Okay? So, the question is, to us the law of human nature belongs. Is the law of human nature merely a convention? Or is it like this? Okay? Lewis says there's 2 reasons for saying it belongs to the latter. The first is you see it everywhere. All cultures have this notion of oughtness. Doesn't matter where. Doesn't matter if they are technologically or educationally advanced, Western Europe or the United States, or if they are technologically and intellectually primitive, like, one of the tribes in the middle of the Amazon. No, even they have a sense of oughtness. It's okay to have many wives, but it's not okay to have too many wives. Okay? So he goes on. Let's see. He talks about progress. Means not just changing, but changing for the better. Skip the sentence after that. In fact, of course, we all do believe that some moralities are better than others. Do we?
People tend to prefer their own.
People tend to prefer their own. Okay.
And often what seems more fair to them, not just their own. Take bits and pieces of other people's morality and say, well, I think that will work better.
And yet we do hear things like, who are you to judge how I behave? Or, who are you, your country, to judge how our country behaves? I mean, there is this thing, pretty rampant. Oh, I thought this was a good one. Of moral relativism. This idea that there is no real single standard. And that what is good for one society may not be good for another society. And that therefore, how can we, society A, judge society B? I mean, look at what's the biggest conflict going on in the world right now? It's between 2 competing ideologies. One of them you can call The ideology of the West. Which means what? Progress, innovation, generally Western humanities thought. Liberal democracy, I'm not meaning liberal as in liberal versus conservative, but liberal democracy, freedom of choice, freedom of individual rights, okay? You know, the kind of stuff that gets enshrined in things like Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, the United Nations Statement on Human Rights, things like that. Versus, what is, I mean, to be honest here, what is really at war with this? Come on, somebody please say it so I don't have to. Okay, not just Muslim. It's this. It's not just this word. It's that. Because what does this mean? You put the ism at the end of almost anything and it implies this superiority of communism, capitalism, okay? Socialism. That ism, okay, is telling you this is the best. So this ideology is essentially saying what? And I'm not talking about the stupid Murfreesboro Mosque and all the crap that went on here. Let them build the biggest blankety blank mosque they want, okay? No, I'm talking about the notion that we see throughout, for example, North Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, that this has got to be established and spread to replace, reconstitute, reconfigure, use whatever term you want. The old caliphate that stretched from Tours in France to Persia. Okay. People thought, you know, Alexander the Great's empire was big. It wasn't half as big as the caliphate before Charles Martel stopped it at the Battle of Tours. Okay. So, we do believe some moralities are better than others. We do believe that some of the people who tried to change the moral ideas of their own age were what we would call reformers or pioneers. That is, people who understood morality better than their neighbors did. You need a real world example and don't want to get caught, you know, all caught up in this and be called, you know, Islamophobic and all that kind of stuff. What happened in the 19th century in England first before it happened in the 18th century in America? What was outlawed? Slavery was outlawed. Okay. Led by William Wilberforce in England. And then Lincoln here. Progress? Or is it just a competing idea? Is it just that the South lost the battle? And maybe they'll rise again, you know, various places around here. Not so far away, in fact. Okay? And you'll find some ideas like that. The moment you say one set of moral ideas can be better than another, you are in fact by a standard. Which idea is better? Peace, love, and happiness versus Nazism, National Socialism. Most people would say, well, peace, love, and happiness. Why?
Most people don't like Nazis.
Okay, most people don't like Nazis, unless you're a Nazi. See, the problem you get into with this is, how do you then say the Nazis are wrong? Maybe for their time, their situation, Hitler was correct.
Well, I'd say by William James's standards, they got their country destroyed.
Okay, you can look at the ends. What do the ends say?
The cash value of their idea is the resulted in the disharmony.
Okay? And that's why you have places like universities where you have the free and open exchange of ideas, except for many universities across the United States, banning certain ideas and certain kinds of speech so that you don't have an open expression. So that certain ideas then become privileged and they don't have to be defended. And if they don't have to be defended, then they're no longer thought about. And if they're not thought about, then what happens? Eventually they become empty and meaningless so that something else can come in and take over. So if you allow all ideas to be debated, all ideas, whites are superior to Jews, Hispanics are superior to whites, Asians are superior to everybody, and you let them hammer those ideas out, okay, what should happen? Idea, the most logical, the most forceful idea, wins. Have you ever watched a debate between just a hardcore racist and somebody who wasn't? The person who isn't a racist wins every time, hands down. Why? Better arguments, the more logical arguments, okay? Which is why those kinds of ideas ought to be able to be argued, which is why you ought to be able to have people who are against homosexuality argue against homosexuality, and people who are for it argue for it, and not have either side supported or buttressed or helped by the powers that be. Let them duke it out, metaphorically, intellectually, not physically.
But
Right?
then you get the argument that that you can't win a debate.
Well, if you can't win the debate, what does that mean?
No, that's what's been going on, saying that you can't win debates. There's no clear winner in a
Inherently
debate.
unlovable.
That debates are unwinnable?
Yeah.
Based on like an opinion, you're saying? Like, so if somebody was like opinionated, they would say that somebody won just based on their opinion?
No, it's that you not really converting anybody to your side. So there's no winning.
Well, there may not. Because
Yeah.
some people, for example, to use the racism issue, you know, what kind of belief is prejudice? Belief. It's something often that is instilled in you from youth, okay, from childhood. Can people be prejudiced? Yes, they can. Often it's not through argument, it's through experience. Who is not like them, who they've held these wild, should I use this idea, this image? It's a political one.
Use it.
I'm a political junkie.
What?
Me? Yeah.
Shut
What was the image? Doesn't matter your politics. What was the image that the president's campaign attempted to put across of Governor Romney? Let's say for the last 3 months, or the months from June through August, before the convention.
They're using a time from the middle class.
Okay.
Wealthy.
That he was detached from the middle class because he is filthy rich. I mean, 260 million, I think is his net worth, something like that. Okay. That he is middle class, that he doesn't care about the middle class, that he was a corporate raider. He took over businesses to shut them down, pull the wealth out the streets, that, you know, he didn't care about people's health. He killed a steel worker's wife, essentially. Okay. A whole variety. I mean, campaign ad after negative campaign ad after, you know, he was cruel to animals because he put his dog on the roof of his car and went for a travel. He wants to kill Big Bird, probably eat it for dinner, you know, all that kind of stuff. Okay. So what happened to Mitt Romney's favorable ratings in polls? Well, as those ads were broadcast across the various places, his positives went down and down and down and down and down. What stopped that? One thing.
Was it Obama's comment on abortion?
Nope.
So,
The Denver debate, where Governor Romney was able to speak to the American people without the filter of whatever the media is, okay, without the filter of a campaign, and they kind of like, well, this guy doesn't look like he has horns and a tail and a pitchfork. He doesn't look like he wants to kill people. He doesn't look like he wants to steal bread from babies. He doesn't. Okay? The image that was created, poof. Okay? So, how did that happen? Maybe that wasn't the real. The president says he's lying. That's not really him. The real him is somewhere else. But whether it was or not, it was the image that Ron projected that held up to this other image. People said, well, this one doesn't look real anymore. It looks phony. So take this image. Heard a thing when I was in my office during lunch. Somebody's come out with a poll. I don't know if it's Gallup or Rasmussen or something. It says, taking all three of the presidential debates, leave the vice presidential one aside. Taking all three of the presidential debates, who won overall? It was like 49 to 42, Romney. Even though Obama is supposed to have won the last two. Okay? For what that means. So, the moment you can say one set of moral ideas can be better than another, I don't know how I got off on that, can be better than another, you are in fact measuring them both by a standard, saying that one of them conforms to that standard and the other. Okay? But the standard that measures the two things is something different. So when you talk about this and you say, let's say Christianity is better than Nazism. This isn't the standard by which you're judging. You are saying that there is somehow something over here, okay, like a scale that both are weighed in. And that this outweighs this one. So there's got to be some kind of scale that is used to determine the rightness, wrongness. So, you are in fact comparing them both with some real morality. Admitting that there is such a thing as a real right, independent of what people think. What has he just said? Or why is that significant?
Never for theism.
Okay, it's laying the groundwork for theism.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying it's his claim, but it's his lever.
Right, okay? He's saying there's something objective. There's something outside of ourselves that says this is true. This is right. Okay, if there's something outside of ourselves that says this is true, this is right, then there must be something also that says this is wrong or this is false. In other words, ultimate right, wrong are completely, totally objective. They are outside of us. Okay? So, if your moral ideas can be truer, and those of the Nazis less true, then there must be something, some real morality for them to be true about. The reason why your idea of New York can be truer or less true than mine is that New York is a real place, existing in quite apart from what either of us thinks. If when each of us said New York, each means merely the town I'm imagining in my own head, how could one of us have truer ideas than the other? I mean, let that sink in. Because what's he saying? I have an idea of Murfreesboro that one of my sisters does not. She can have an idea of Murfreesboro, but her idea of Murfreesboro will not be anywhere near the truth because she's never been here. Similarly, she has an idea of Uppsala, Sweden, and I have an idea of Uppsala, Sweden. But my idea of Uppsala, Sweden is totally foreign to hers because she actually lived in Uppsala, Sweden for a couple of years. Okay? There would be no question of truth or falsehood at all if there was what? No objective reality known as Murfreesboro or Uppsala. Okay? or right and wrong. In the same way, if the rule of decent behavior meant simply whatever each nation happens to approve, there would be no sense in saying that any one nation had ever been more correct in its approval than any other. In other words, what would be right or wrong for the world would be simple majority vote. Who has the upper hand in the United Nations Security Council? Is that really how you want morality to be decided? Okay. I mean, keep in mind with that little image, what's the problem with the United Nations Security Council?
It's like, just like a few nations that pretty much just control it.
Yeah, there are 5 nations that have what?
Veto
Veto power. Which 5?
It's
Anybody know?
Russia, China,
US, France, Britain.
UK.
Russia, China, United States, France, and Britain. Why in the world France was ever given veto power at the end of World War II when, it hadn't been a world power for 300 years?
And that's what diplomacy gets you.
And that's
All these people dissing diplomacy because they want to be the tough guy. Worked for France, and I think the people ought to pay attention.
it worked for France, not so much for the others. Same thing. China, USSR. Were we really allies with the USSR at the end of World War II? Just think of that little problem that happened in Germany. So, no sense in saying that the world could ever grow morally better or morally worse. So now he goes on to the reality of the law. Okay, so he's taking this kind of point by point. So, he says at the end of the first paragraph, I'm not concerned at present with blame. I'm trying to find out truth. And from that point of view, the very idea of something being imperfect, of its not being what it ought to be, has certain consequences. Well, what is the thing not being what it ought to be? Everybody says at one point or another in their life, well, in a perfect world, you wouldn't have to listen to me. I mean, in a perfect world, I wouldn't have to listen to me. Okay? In a perfect world, how would it be different? Obviously. There'd be no war, there'd be no poverty, there'd be no death, there'd be no all the things Tolkien writes about people want to escape from. Okay? And yet, there are all those things. And yet, we feel there shouldn't be. That's the truth. I don't want to get at blame. Why are there the horrible bad things there are in the world? He says, I don't want to get at that. I want to get at the truth thing. Why do we have this idea that it should be any different? Right? So he says, if you take a tree, it is what it is. And there seems no sense in saying it ought to have been otherwise. Okay, now, take that notion and apply it to yourself. Because I bet everybody in this room has something about themselves they'd like to be able to change, or they wish was different. They wish they were taller, they wish they were shorter, they wish they were skinnier, they wish they were handsomer or prettier. They probably don't wish they were less handsome or less pretty. They wish they sounded better, they wish they could run faster, write better, think clearer, whatever the case may be. Okay? You may say a stone is the wrong shape, but only for what? If you want to use it for a particular purpose. You can't go out to Yosemite, my favorite place backpacking when I lived in California. You can't go out to Yosemite, look at Half Dome and say, there's just about that. Like, the glaciers, they really did that wrong. Or El Capitan, it's got that funny shit. It's still ludicrous. Similarly, you can't look at a giraffe and go, no. Or, God must have been stoned when he came up with the giraffe. Doesn't work that way, yeah. All you mean is that the stone or the tree does not happen to be convenient for some purpose. So he goes to that and says, okay, now, you get where I'm getting at? it follows that what we usually call the laws of nature, the way weather works on it, for example, may not really be laws in the strict sense, but only a manner of speaking. And he goes on to talk about the law of gravity. Now skip down to about 2/3 of the way in that paragraph. The law of gravity tells you what stones do if you drop them. Always, right? With one exception. If you drop a stone in a vacuum, okay, it will fall slower. Or if you drop it where there's no gravity, it won't drop. But the law of human nature tells you what human beings ought to do and do not. In other words, just because you know the law of human nature doesn't mean you can say, oh, well, I know what so-and-so is going to do then. If only life worked that way, right? In other words, dealing with humans, something else comes in above and beyond the actual facts. You have the facts. That is how we do behave. But you have something else. How they ought to behave. Okay? Because humans aren't like, with a few exceptions. That is, if they're hungry, they must be fed. If it's a baby in it, it must be changed, or your life will be a living hell until it is changed. Okay? So, in the rest of the universe, it won't be anything but the facts. Electrons and molecules behave in a certain way. And guess what? Given the same situation, they will always behave in the same way. But we won't. If I came in here one day, I just won the lottery, and I had a stack of bills, all different denominations. And I walk around and I start handing out bills.
That would be awesome.
And she gets a 1, Paul gets a 2, and Tom gets a, I don't know, 100, and Autumn gets a penny. What's the reaction to be? Hey, you gave him 100, I only got a penny. Why?
Fair.
It's not fair.
I'd be okay.
Okay? Men behave in a certain way, and that is not the whole story.
Good throw.
For instance, we might try to make out a man ought not to act as he does. You only mean the same as when you say that a stone is the wrong shape. In other words, when you say a man has acted wrongly, all that you really mean is he's acted wrongly in your use or need or purpose for him. Like the parking spot you were waiting for. He acted wrongly. Really? Is that wrong? You see an open parking spot? Is it wrong is it wrong to take it? No, it's not wrong. Okay. Is it wrong to take it if there's another way? Say you're driving a big 4x4 and the other car is a little smart car and you just decide to push it out of the way, which you easily could do. You could do that with your bare hands on a smart car. Okay? No, that would be wrong. He says what he's doing happens to be inconvenient. Untrue. So you cannot say, skipping several lines, that what we call decent behavior in others is simply the behavior that happens to be useful. And as for decent behavior in ourselves, I suppose it's pretty obvious that it does not mean the behavior that pays. That is, it pays for us. It means things like being content with 30 shillings when you might have got 3 pounds. Doing honestly when it would be easy to cheat. Leaving a girl alone when you'd like to make love to her. It's assuming she doesn't want to. Staying in dangerous places when you would rather go somewhere safer. Keeping promises you'd rather not keep. How many times have you told somebody you would help them do something, like move? And then you wake up Saturday morning and you just don't want to. And telling the truth makes you look a fool. It all depends on what the meaning of is. Anybody catch that reference? Okay. Why did Clinton perjure himself? Because he didn't want to find out he was cheating on her in the Oval Office. Okay? Because it would make him look bad. Some people say that though decent conduct does not mean what pays each particular person at a particular moment, still it means what pays the human race as a whole. That is, decent behavior is what is generally good for all people. So what is morally good is what benefits all of us. This is the theory of utilitarianism. That which benefits the most people. You know, it's Spock in one of the Star Trek films. One should die for the greater good. Okay? Lewis says no. An explanation of why we feel as we do about right and wrong, as an explanation of why we feel about right and wrong, it just misses the point. If we ask, why ought I to be in society, and you replied, because it's good for society, then we could ask, well, why should I care what's good for society? I mean, think about it. Screw society, right?
This is where he plays a little card trick.
Okay, explain.
He discounts the possibility that people could be disposed towards this through any evolutionary action. That is to say, arguments assumes that individual self-interest, because it, to a certain point of view, necessarily promotes the individual best, is what an individual is necessarily inclined towards.
Okay.
And he admits the ability that a being could have, that beings could arise who are so constructed to have an action towards helping the greater whole, even if that interest acts against their individual benefit.
Okay. Counter, I think, to, I'm not saying that it's wrong. I think Lewis would counter that and would say, how did that consciousness arise?
And I can say evolution and say God.
Exactly. It's the two different perspectives. Okay. So he goes on. Why should I care what's good for society except when it happens to pay me personally? Then you will have to say, because you ought to be unselfish, which brings you back to the oughtness. Okay. Because, kind of following on Paul's comment, you know, one of those laws of human nature, not laws of nature, but human nature, is that idea of self-preservation. But if that idea of self-preservation comes into conflict with the preservation of okay, you get into that oughtness. And Lewis is saying that oughtness cannot come from within. The evolutionary argument says it can come from within. Okay? So, skipping down to the next paragraph. Shoot. I'm not getting nearly as far as we need to. Lewis says, skip the first 2 or 3 sentences. The moral law, or law of human nature, is not simply a fact about human behavior in the same way as the law of gravitation is, or maybe simply a fact about how every object behaves. On the other hand, it's not a mere fancy. That is, it's not something we've made up. Why? Because we can't get rid of it. It's not simply a statement about how we should like men to behave for our own convenience. For the behavior we call bad or unfair is not exactly the same as the behavior we call inconvenient. It isn't always. Sometimes behavior is very convenient. Okay? Consequently, this rule of right and wrong, or law of human nature, or whatever you must call it, must somehow or other be a real thing. Something that's really there, not something we've made up. So it begins to look as if we shall have to admit that there is more kind of reality. That in this particular case, there's something above and beyond the ordinary facts of men's behavior. And yet quite definitely real. A real law, something we find pressing on us. And that's what he's going to pick up with in the next chapter. What lies behind the law. That is, what's the source of the law? Okay? And we'll pick up there.